starts with who you want to be. So if you want to be somebody famous, cool, because then there's probably a biography you can consult. And that should be the starting point, not the ending point. Start with the biography, move into diaries, letters, any kind of records that family may have held, like wills and probates and things like that. And by the way, that crap is so hard to come across if you don't work at a museum or a like university or whatever. There's a whole community full of people that have access to that information. So I would say sort of, on this site or jump on Facebook or do both and look for those resources because they're out there. You don't have to feel like you're starting from scratch. And then if you don't want to be a famous person, which is fine because there are far fewer famous people in the past than there are everyday people, right, whose names aren't recorded in the history books. So for a wife of a Scottish Highlander, a New York loyalist, I would start though with like following the army, belonging to the army, it's called.
Right.
There's a book called Belonging to the Army.
Yeah.
Start with something like the Valley Forge Winter to find out what encampments are like for women. And when you get those sort of generalized things, then you say, okay, but I'm a loyalist. Not with the Continental Army. Are there any books or is there any information about probably male loyalists that I can dig through and find the little details about the women who are with them? And it's harder for ladies than it is for men. Sorry, there's not as much written, right? We are always looking through the lenses of the men with whom we are associated.
Right. Yeah. True.
And then you say, okay, cool. Loyalist followers, great. What about Northern Loyalist followers? I may be marching through North Carolina, but I come from New York.
Mm-hmm.
So what was and that's not so much like what is she experiencing as a New Yorker right now, but what are her beliefs? How was she brought up? Why is she a loyalist in the first place? And how the heck did she get down here to North Carolina? She must not have had enough money or influence or business to stay at home and run things by herself. She figured her best bet was to marry an officer or a soldier, enlisted soldier in the Scottish Highlander Regiment and march to North Carolina. I mean, there's a lot of circumstance.
That's a whole lot right there.
That's a whole lot.
That's a whole lot. There's no Greyhound bus.
Yeah. And there's not all that much detail in the history book, but you can extrapolate.
Yeah.
And then for the things that you can't extrapolate, I feel like that's the stuff that gets more to the heart of human nature anyway. If she's in North Carolina and she's been there for months or years, she probably misses home.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to decide, can she read and write? Because if she can, she's probably finding a way to write home. And if she can't, she may be asking somebody who can to do it for her. Maybe she has no family and that's why she had to leave. Well, what kind of life does that make then? Oh my gosh. Does she have friends in the unit? How did she, female society? So you start to ask questions about the person you want to be, because those are the questions that people are going to ask you.
Yeah, that's right.
It seems overwhelming, but you just start with a few questions.
So there are some very common things that people come into camp and they ask, and every reenactor knows those common things.
Is that fire real?
Are y'all going to eat that?
What are you cooking? Are you really going to eat
that? So sometimes it can be a challenge to educate the audience. It can be, where you might want to talk about these really interesting things or tell this woman's story or, whatever the thing is that you feel like you really want to, if I'm doing my petty cutlery, then I want to talk about all of these parts. And, we might have someone's attention span for 30 seconds. Do you have any advice on ways to engage more with your audience or give them bite-sized pieces? What are your thoughts?
Sure. That kind of experience comes with practice. So the more you talk about boring stuff, the more you get in flipping the conversation to something that you want to talk about. So I fielded with a British unit. I when I can, I will. But I fielded with a British unit last summer, and the men are supposed to be their own mess. They're supposed to cook for themselves. And then the women are supposed to cook for themselves and the children. And we actually had a fair number of women in that encampment. And the men were so busy with drilling and then portraying the battle and all these things that I said, okay, I'll cook for you, but you're paying me. And of course they didn't, but that's the jumping off point. So people come up with this notion that women always cooked for the men. And I got real salty. That absolutely not. I'm doing this for pay. You think that I'd be willing to cook a full ration for a man when my ration is half of his? I'd be soon as like to take his other half a ration for myself. But these men promised to pay me, so I'll cook for them today. And then we get past, yeah, we're really going to eat this. Yes, I'm really cooking an 18th century recipe. Hey, we're in South Carolina. What's your favorite meal in South Carolina in a hot July summer? Oh, corn on the cob? Cool, because I'm cooking that too. Grows right over there in the field. I went and robbed those Continental Patriots. Now we're having corn because the crap that the Army gives us isn't enough to feed anyone. So it's just, if you're stuck cooking, then people think it's kind of a pain in the butt to figure out what region you're in, what's in season, and then what are 18th century recipes. I love that because if I go to all that trouble, that's what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. And that visitor is going to hear about it. And so it's like, are you going to eat that? Heck yeah, I'm going to eat that. I just marched 50 miles over the past 3 days. I'm starving. I'm hungry. You're darn right I'm going to eat this, and I'm going to eat it because I cooked it for me, not for those dudes. They can handle themselves or whatever. So even if you're in the third person, you can still talk about that. Well, we didn't expect to have corn on the cob today, but the commander stopped us for the night here on this farm. So it's a target of opportunity. Here we are.
Yes.
And that's really not, that's like a moment of first person, but that doesn't require all that sort of research and immersive.
Right.
Because then you say, yeah, the commander stopped us here and now we have added rations, which is great. And then you say, normally the woman wouldn't have cooked for their unit. And you just drive right back into that third person, right back into that place where you're comfortable. So it's just practice. Like, you have to talk about the boring stuff before you figure out how you'd rather talk about it. Because the audience doesn't know what they don't know. Half the time they're asking you that boring stuff because they don't know how to ask the deeper questions.
That's true. That's a good point. And oftentimes I think in the reenacting circuit, they're there to see a battle. They're there to see muskets being fired, cannons being fired. So sometimes as women, we might not be the main show. So, but what we're there to tell, the stories that we're there to tell, I think are equally, sometimes more important, because I cherish those stories and I like researching those stories and sharing those stories about women. But I think
the other thing that would be cool, because I know that, we're a couple of women, and so we're talking a lot about women's living history, but if you're a guy in this and you're in camp and there are women around, you don't necessarily have to talk to the audience that comes up to you about the weapon you're holding or about the battle that you have just fought. Yep. It would be really nice if you said, hey, did you meet that woman over there? She's my wife. Or, if you're in the first person, that's my wife. And I can't believe that she has to endure this. Soldiers of His Majesty's army can barely endure this. Look at that woman over there. She's right here with us every step of the way. And if you're not in the first person, you can say the same thing, just in the third person context. She represents women who endured the same thing that the king's own regiments endured. And she's here, and she's not required to be in servitude to us. We pay her to sew clothes. We pay her to bind wounds. And if we're lucky, she'll help us cook every once in a while. You guys can help fill out the story. And it's not because we think that you should always redirect the story away from the really interesting firearm that you're carrying or the really important battle. But when you help create the larger context, everybody comes away better educated. So if you guys do it with us, that will help shift the paradigm of the hobby.